The morning started like any other, coffee brewing, toast burning slightly, because Emma always left it in too long. I watched her from across the kitchen, memorizing the way sunlight caught her dark hair as she hummed absently, scrolling through her phone. 15 years of marriage, and these quiet moments still made my heart skip. Thomas? Her voice carried that familiar warmth. Don't forget we're having dinner with the Hendersons tonight. I nodded, though something in her tone made me pause. Emma had been pushing for more social engagements lately, which was unusual for her. She'd always been more of a homebody, preferring quiet evenings with just the two of us. Sarah mentioned bringing someone new, she added, not quite meeting my eyes. A colleague of Robert's. Just moved to the city. That's when I noticed it. The smallest thing, really. As she spoke about this new person, her fingers unconsciously moved to her wedding ring, turning it slowly. It was a habit I'd never seen before, and something about the gesture made my stomach tighten. The day passed in a blur of meetings and client calls. I'm an architect, and deadlines don't care about nagging feelings or subtle changes in your wife's behavior. But as I drove home that evening, Emma's ring-turning moment kept replaying in my mind. The Hendersons' house was warm and inviting as always. Sarah's famous lasagna, Robert's terrible jokes. Everything felt normal until he walked in. James Chun, the colleague. Tall, confident, with an easy smile that seemed to light up the room. I watched as he greeted everyone, but it was his handshake with Emma that made time stop for a heartbeat. Their hands touched for precisely the right amount of time. Their smiles were perfectly appropriate. But something in Emma's eyes changed. A flash of something I couldn't name, or maybe didn't want to. James is taking over the marketing department, Robert explained. Moved here from Seattle last month. Emma's voice was casual. Too casual. Oh, that's right near that coffee shop I love. The one with the amazing almond croissants. Magnolia Brew? James replied. I just discovered it. Best coffee in the city. I watched my wife's face light up with genuine enthusiasm, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt like an outsider looking in. The feeling was subtle, barely there, like a hairline crack in fine china. You might not notice it at first glance, but once you see it, you can't look away. Later that night, as Emma slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening. The way she laughed at James's jokes. Not her usual polite laugh, but the real one, the one that came from deep in her chest. The way she positioned herself at dinner so she could see him easily. The way her hand had moved to her wedding ring again when he mentioned being divorced. You're being ridiculous, I whispered to myself in the darkness. She's your wife. She loves you. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, Emma's phone buzzed softly on her nightstand. In the dim light, I caught a glimpse of the screen before it went dark. A new message from an unknown number. I told myself it was nothing, just another ordinary day in our perfect life. But deep down, in that place where truth lives even when we try to deny it, I knew something had changed. The first time Emma stayed late at work, I didn't think much of it. The second time, I made her favorite pasta and left it warming in the oven. By the third time that week, the pasta had grown cold, and something else had begun to cool inside me. The Morrison account is crucial, she explained, her cheeks flushed as she dropped her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door. It was nearly 10 p.m. Marketing needs to nail this pitch, and James thinks. The name hung between us like smoke. James. Always James now. I brought you dinner, I said instead of all the other words crowding my throat. It's probably dried out. Her face softened with guilt. Oh, Thomas, you didn't have to. She crossed the kitchen and pressed her lips to my cheek, but something was different about her scent. Not just her perfume. Her very presence seemed altered, as if she'd stepped out of our shared reality into something I couldn't quite grasp. That night, I watched her get ready for bed, cataloging changes I hadn't noticed gathering like storm clouds. The new silk blouse she'd bought last week. The way she'd started wearing her hair down more often. The dark waves falling past her shoulders the way they had when we first met. Small changes that seemed innocent alone, but together formed a pattern I wasn't ready to recognize. The Hendersons invited us over this weekend, she mentioned casually, applying her night cream in slow, deliberate circles. Sarah's making her paella. My stomach tightened. Will James be there? Her hands paused for just a fraction of a second. I think so. Robert mentioned something about showing him around, helping him settle in. She met my eyes in the mirror. Why? No reason. I lied, matching her casualness with my own. Just curious. But curiosity had nothing to do with the way my hands clenched under the covers that night, or how I lay awake listening to her breathing change as she drifted into sleep. I thought about the way James had looked at her at that first dinner, how his eyes seemed to follow her movements with a physicist's precision, calculating trajectories I didn't want to contemplate. The next morning, I left for work early, driving past Emma's office building on my way. The parking lot was already filling up. I spotted her car easily. We'd chosen it together 3 years ago, a sensible sedan in deep blue. But it was the car parked 2 spaces away that made my heart stutter. A sleek black Tesla with a Seattle license plate. That evening, Emma called to say she'd be late again. The Morrison account, of course. I sat in our kitchen, staring at the meal I'd prepared, her favorite pasta growing cold once more, and opened my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing. Signs your wife is having an affair. The screen filled with answers I didn't want to see. Changed appearance. Working late. New friends. Emotional distance. Different perfume. Each point struck like a hammer against glass, creating spiderweb cracks in the foundation of my certainty. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah Henderson. Coming Saturday? James is bringing his famous tiramisu. I stared at the message until the words blurred. Of course he made tiramisu. Of course it was famous. Of course he'd be there, in our circle now, weaving himself into the fabric of our lives with the patience of a master craftsman. When Emma finally came home that night, her eyes were bright with excitement. We might actually land the Morrison account, she said, dropping onto the couch beside me. James has this incredible vision for the campaign. He thinks. I stood abruptly, the laptop nearly falling from my knees. I'm going to bed. She looked up, startled by my tone. Thomas? Are you okay? Just tired, I said, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. Long day. As I climbed the stairs, I heard her phone chime. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. I didn't turn around to see her response. Didn't want to watch her fingers fly across the screen. Didn't want to notice if she was smiling. But I knew she was. And somewhere in Seattle, a moving company was probably packing up the rest of James Chen's belongings, preparing to ship them to our city, to his new life. To my wife. The call came at 3:47 a.m. Robert Henderson had suffered a heart attack. As I watched Emma throw on clothes in the gray pre-dawn light, her movements precise despite the panic, I remembered how she'd once told me hospitals terrified her. Now she was insisting on going. Sarah needs me, she said, fingers trembling as she fastened her necklace, the one I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. I have to be there. I drove through empty streets, streetlights casting intermittent shadows across Emma's face. In these fragments of illumination, I caught glimpses of someone I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. Her phone kept lighting up with messages, but she'd angled it away from me. The emergency room pulsed with that particular tension unique to hospitals at night. Fluorescent lights casting everyone in sickly shades of truth. Sarah was there. Mascara tracked down her cheeks, hands clutching a paper cup of untouched coffee. And beside her, looking surprisingly put together for 4 a.m., stood James. Emma's steps faltered for just a moment when she saw him. If I hadn't been watching her every moment lately, I might have missed it. I came as soon as I heard, James said, his voice carrying that perfect note of concern. He looked at Sarah, but his body was oriented toward my wife, like a compass finding north. The hours blurred together in the waiting room. Robert would be fine, the doctors assured us. They'd caught it in time. I watched Emma make phone calls, arrange for Sarah's children to be picked up from their sleepover, coordinate with Robert's office. She'd always been the organized one, the one who knew exactly what needed to be done in a crisis. But it was the quiet moments between tasks that unraveled me. The way she and James moved in unconscious synchronization, getting coffee, speaking in half sentences that somehow contained whole conversations. At one point, I returned from the bathroom to find them standing close, too close, by the vending machines, their voices low and intimate. They sprang apart when they saw me, but not before I caught the tail end of their exchange. "Can't keep doing this," Emma was saying, her voice raw with something I couldn't identify. James's response was lost in the hospital's ambient noise, but his hand had been on her arm, and the ghost of that touch seemed to linger in the air between them. Later, as dawn began to seep through the windows, Emma's phone rang. She stepped away to take the call, but not before I glimpsed the screen. Unknown number. "Work," she mouthed at me, but her fingers were doing that thing again, twisting her wedding ring, a nervous tell I'd never noticed before that first dinner with James. I watched her through the glass doors of the waiting room, observed how her free hand gestured as she spoke, animated, alive in a way she rarely was with me anymore. When had that happened? When had I become the person she performed for, while saving her true self for furtive phone calls and late nights at the office? Sarah's voice broke through my thoughts. "Thank God Emma's here," she said, squeezing my hand. "I don't know what I'd do without her. She and James have been amazing. They've taken over everything at work, so I don't have to worry." My throat constricted. "They work together often?" "Oh, constantly since he took over marketing. They make such a great team." Sarah's smile was genuine, oblivious. "Emma's been staying late almost every night helping him settle in. Such a blessing to have them both." Each word felt like another step down a dark staircase, my foot meeting empty air where I expected solid ground. When Emma returned, her cheeks were flushed despite the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. "That was the client," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The Morrison account. They need some changes to the proposal." "At 6 a.m.? The question slipped out before I could stop it. The look she gave me was complex, guilt, defiance, something else I couldn't name. James chose that moment to approach, 2 fresh coffees in hand. He offered one to Emma, who accepted it with a smile that made my chest ache. "Just how you like it," he said softly. And there was the simple intimacy of knowing how someone takes their coffee. I remember when that was my role, my privilege. Now I watched as Emma took a perfect sip of a perfectly prepared coffee and wondered how many morning meetings, how many late nights it had taken for James to learn that detail about my wife. On the drive home, exhaustion heavy in our bones, Emma's phone buzzed again. She didn't check it this time, but her hand moved to her pocket, an unconscious gesture of acknowledgement. The sun was fully up now, painting our world in harsh clarity. As we pulled into our driveway, Emma spoke suddenly. "I might have to go to the office today." "The Morrison account." "It's Saturday," I interrupted, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. She didn't respond immediately, and in that silence, I heard everything she wasn't saying. Just for a few hours, she finally offered like a consolation prize. I nodded, wondering if she could hear how loud my heart was beating, if she knew that every time she mentioned work now, I pictured James's hand on her arm, his voice low and intimate by the vending machines. Our house stood before us, solid and familiar. But as I watched Emma gather her things, preparing to leave again, I realized that homes, like marriages, can become facades, perfect from the outside while slowly crumbling within. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Cedar walls glowing amber in the sunset, lakes stretching out like polished obsidian. Emma and I had spent our honeymoon here 15 years ago, young and drunk on possibilities. Now we stood in that same space, the air between us thick with unspoken accusations. "It'll be good for us," Emma had said when she suggested the weekend getaway, her voice carrying that forced brightness I'd grown to dread. "Just like old times." But old times didn't include her checking her phone every few minutes, or the way she flinched when I touched her shoulder. They didn't include the stranger my wife had become, who wore unfamiliar perfume and laughed at messages from unknown numbers. I watched her unpack, her movements precise and controlled. She'd bought new lingerie for the trip, black lace I'd never seen before. The tags were still attached, and something about that detail made my stomach turn. Had she bought it for this weekend, or for someone else? "I thought we could take the boat out," I suggested, trying to recapture something of our past selves. "Watch the sunset like we used to." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe tomorrow? I need to check on something for the Morrison account first." The Morrison account. Always the Morrison account. Does James need you on a Saturday? The words escaped before I could stop them, sharp-edged and dangerous. Emma's hands stilled on her suitcase. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. Everything. Just seems like the Morrison account needs a lot of attention lately. This is exactly why I suggested this trip, she snapped, abandoning any pretense of unpacking. You've been impossible lately. Suspicious, controlling. Controlling? Because I'd like my wife's attention for one weekend? Your wife. Her laugh was bitter, unfamiliar. When was the last time you asked about my day? About what I want? James, at least. The name hung between us like a loaded gun. James what? My voice was quiet now, too quiet. Emma turned away, but not before I caught the shimmer of tears in her eyes. Nothing. He listens. I wanted to scream that I would listen too, if she'd ever talk to me about anything real anymore. Instead, I walked out onto the deck, letting the screen door slam behind me. The lake stretched out before me, indifferent to our drama. A loon called somewhere in the distance, its cry haunting and lonely. Later that night, I woke to an empty bed. The clock read 2:17 a.m. I found Emma on the deck, illuminated by the blue glow of her phone screen. She was crying, silent tears tracking down her cheeks as her fingers moved across the keyboard. Emma! She startled, nearly dropping the phone. I couldn't sleep. Who are you texting at 2 in the morning? No one. She locked the screen too quickly. Just checking emails. Don't. My voice cracked. Don't lie to me. Not here. Not in this place. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of water lapping against the shore and the weight of 15 years of shared history. I'm not lying, she whispered, but her hand moved to her wedding ring, that telling gesture I'd grown to hate. Show me your phone, then. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. What? If it's just emails, show me your phone. I can't believe you're doing this. She stood abruptly, backing away from me. This isn't you, Thomas. You're paranoid. You're seeing things that aren't. Aren't what, Emma? Aren't real? Like the late nights? The secret calls? The way you look at him? At who? But her voice trembled on the question. You know who. She ran her hands through her hair, a gesture so familiar it hurt. I'm going to bed. This weekend was clearly a mistake. I stayed on the deck until sunrise, watching light creep across the lake. Behind me, through the bedroom window, I could hear Emma's muffled voice. She was on the phone again, speaking too softly for me to make out the words. We drove home in silence the next day, the weekend's attempt at reconciliation lying in ruins between us. As I navigated the familiar roads, I remembered our honeymoon drive up here, how Emma had sung along to the radio, how we'd stopped at every scenic overlook just because we could. Now she sat beside me, physically close but unreachable, tapping out messages to someone who wasn't her husband. In the side mirror, I watched our cabin disappear around a bend, another piece of our history transformed into something unrecognizable. Just like us. Mark showed up unannounced on a Sunday morning, looking exactly as he had in college, just with more gray at his temples now. He stood on our doorstep, travel bag in hand, while autumn leaves spiraled down around him. I hadn't seen my oldest friend in 3 years, but something in his eyes told me this wasn't just a casual visit. Your mother called me, he said simply. The words hung between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. My mother, who'd been battling cancer for months, had always treated Mark like a second son. Of course she'd call him. Of course she'd know I needed him, even before I did. Emma was at work again. The Morrison account apparently required 7-day attention now. The house felt emptier than usual as I led Mark to the kitchen, where morning sunlight cast long shadows across unwashed coffee cups and unopened mail. How long has it been going on? Mark asked, not touching the coffee I'd placed before him. My hand stilled on the counter. What? Thomas. His voice was gentle, the way you'd speak to a wounded animal. I was in town 3 weeks ago for a conference. I saw them. The world tilted sideways, reality shifting like sand beneath my feet. Them, your wife, and a man I didn't recognize. They were at Cafe Luna. He paused, choosing his words carefully. They looked intimate. Cafe Luna. The little Italian place where Emma and I had our first date, where I'd proposed. The betrayal felt architectural in its precision. Did they see you? No. Mark's eyes held a sadness that made my chest ache. But I saw enough. The way they leaned in toward each other. How she touched his hand. I would have told you sooner, but my phone buzzed, interrupting his confession. A text from my sister. Mom's taken a turn. You need to come now. The hospital corridor seemed endless, its fluorescent lights casting everything in stark, unforgiving clarity. Emma arrived 30 minutes after I did, slightly out of breath, her hair damp from what I assumed was a rush shower. The scent of unfamiliar cologne clung faintly to her skin. I came as soon as I could, she said, reaching for my hand. I pulled away, remembering Mark's words. They looked intimate. My mother drifted in and out of consciousness, her once sharp mind clouded by morphine and pain. During one lucid moment, she gripped my hand with surprising strength. She's not who she was, Mom whispered, her eyes finding mine with sudden clarity. I see it. A mother always sees. Mom, don't. Promise me you'll fight for yourself, she insisted, her voice urgent. Promise me you won't let anyone dim your light. She slipped away that evening, as autumn sun painted the hospital room in shades of gold. Emma stood beside me, her presence both comfort and torment. When she touched my shoulder, I couldn't help wondering if her hands had touched him the same way hours earlier. Mark stayed through the funeral preparations, watching Emma with quiet, knowing eyes. I caught him observing her phone habits, how she angled the screen away, how she stepped out to take calls, how her texts always seemed to come in clusters. The signs were there with Caroline, too, he said one night over whiskey, referring to his own divorce past. I just didn't want to see them. That same night, Emma's phone lit up with a message. In the brief moment before she snatched it away, I saw the contact name, Morrison Project. Not James or even James Chun. Just another lie wrapped in careful disguise. After the funeral, in the hollow quiet of our home, Emma tried to hold me. I'm here for you, she whispered. But she wasn't. She hadn't been for months. Later, I found her in the garden, crying into her phone. I can't. Not now, she was saying. He just lost his mother. I know. But please understand. I stood in the doorway, watching my wife console someone else about the inconvenience of my grief. In that moment, I felt my mother's last words echo in my mind. Promise me you'll fight for yourself. The next morning, I went through old photos for the memorial service. In one, taken just 6 months ago, Emma and I smiled at the camera, her head resting naturally on my shoulder. We looked happy. We looked real. But Mark's words haunted me. The signs were there. They had been there all along. I just hadn't wanted to read them. The box arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Elegant white packaging tied with a silver ribbon, no card attached. I found it on our doorstep when I came home early, my mother's absence still a raw wound that made working full days impossible. The package sat there like a confession waiting to be heard, innocent and damning all at once. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, lay a delicate silver bracelet. The kind of intimate gift that speaks of careful observation, of knowing someone's precise tastes. The kind of gift I would have chosen for Emma, once upon a time when I still knew who she was. I placed it on our bedroom dresser and waited, watching shadows lengthen across the hardwood floors as evening approached. Each minute felt like holding my breath underwater, lungs burning with unspoken questions. Emma's reaction when she came home told me everything I needed to know, though not in words. It was in the microsecond freeze of her body when she saw the box, the barely perceptible tremor in her hands as she lifted it. What's this? Her voice aimed for casual but landed somewhere near panic. You tell me. The words came out soft, almost gentle. It was delivered today. She opened it with fingers that had once worn only my rings, once touched only my skin. The silver caught the light, and so did the tears in her eyes. It's nothing, she whispered. A thank you gift. From a client. For the Morrison account. The lie hung between us like smoke, acrid and suffocating. I watched her slip the bracelet back into its box with the careful movements of someone handling evidence. Interesting timing, I said, considering the Morrison presentation isn't for another 2 weeks. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with recognition of her mistake. In that moment, I saw something shift in her expression, the mask slipping to reveal calculation beneath. Thomas, you're being paranoid again. Her voice took on that tone I'd grown to hate. Reasonable, patient, as if I were a child throwing an unfounded tantrum. Ever since your mother passed. Don't. The word came out sharp enough to make her flinch. Don't use her to deflect this. I'm worried about you. She pressed on, moving closer, reaching for me with hands that probably still carried his warmth. You're seeing things that aren't there, creating problems where none exist. Maybe you should talk to someone. Like you talked to James? The name dropped between us like a stone into still water, ripples of truth expanding outward. Emma's face went through a complex series of emotions: shock, guilt, anger, and finally, a carefully constructed concern. James is a colleague, she said firmly. And right now you're not thinking clearly. Grief can make us paranoid. I finished for her. Suspicious? Tell me, Emma, does grief also make your wedding ring leave tan lines? Because I noticed they're fading. She unconsciously touched the ring she'd started wearing less and less. I've been swimming at the gym. Another lie, smooth as silk. I wondered how many untruths she'd told me. How long she'd been crafting this alternate reality where I was the unstable one, the one seeing phantoms in every shadow. The gym. I nodded slowly. The same gym where James happens to work out? The one you never mentioned joining? Color drained from her face. Have you been following me? No. The irony of her accusation twisted in my chest. Sarah mentioned it. Apparently, she's thinking of joining too. Said you and James make quite the workout partners. Emma's composure cracked, just for a moment before she rallied. This is exactly what I mean about your paranoia. Taking innocent comments and twisting them into. Show me your phone. What? Your phone, Emma. Show me your messages. Prove I'm being paranoid. She clutched her bag closer, where her phone lay hidden. I don't have to prove anything. The fact that you'd even ask that shows how irrational you're being. Irrational, I echoed. The word tasted like ashes. Is that what you call it when a husband notices his wife living a double life? I can't talk to you when you're like this. She turned away, grabbing her keys. I'm going to Sarah's. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. As she left, the silver bracelet caught the last light of day, throwing prisms across our bedroom wall. I picked it up, studying its delicate craftsmanship. The clasp was engraved with tiny initials, JC. James Chin wasn't even trying to hide anymore. Or maybe he was just confident in Emma's ability to gaslight me into accepting any explanation she offered. I sat in our darkening bedroom, holding a bracelet that proved everything and nothing, wondering how many other gifts she'd hidden, how many lies she'd told, how many times she'd used my grief as a shield for her betrayal. The house creaked around me, full of memories that suddenly felt suspect. Had she been talking to him in this room while I slept? Had she thought of him in this bed? How long had I been living in a house of cards, believing it was made of stone? My phone buzzed. A text from Mark. How are you holding up? I stared at the message, at the simple kindness it represented, and felt something inside me harden into resolve. The time for doubting myself was over. Emma could twist reality all she wanted, but some truths refused to be buried. Like silver bracelets with damning initials, delivered to the wrong address. The day our carefully separated worlds collided began with rain, a soft, persistent drizzle that painted our windows with streaming tears. I'd been going through old photographs, a masochistic ritual I'd developed since finding the bracelet. Each image of Emma and me felt like examining evidence now. Searching for the exact moment everything changed. When the doorbell rang, I assumed it was another sympathy delivery. People still sending condolences for my mother, unaware that I was mourning 2 losses now. Instead, I opened the door to find James Chun on our doorstep, water darkening his expensive coat, holding a folder marked Morrison Project. Thomas. His voice carried the practiced warmth I'd grown to despise. Emma left these documents at the office. She's not answering her phone, and the client needs signatures today. The casual use of her name The implied intimacy of knowing her phone habits. It all settled in my stomach like broken glass. But it was the way he stood there, so confident on the threshold of my home, that made something snap inside me. "Come in," I heard myself say. "She's upstairs. I'll get her." He stepped into our foyer, bringing with him the scent of rain and that indefinable quality that had first made me uneasy at the Hendersons' dinner. I watched him survey our home, his eyes lingering on photos of Emma and me, on the subtle signs of our shared life. But Emma wasn't upstairs. She wasn't even home. We both knew that. "Interesting," I said softly, watching his reflection in the hallway mirror. "Since I just got off the phone with her. She's at the client's office. Has been all morning." The lie landed between us like a gauntlet. I saw the micro-expression that crossed his face, surprise, then calculation. He was good, I had to give him that. Recovery took only seconds. "Must have been after she called me," he offered smoothly. "I've been in meetings." "Have you?" I moved closer, close enough to catch the faint trace of a familiar scent. Emma's new perfume. Funny how you had time to drive across town with documents that were supposedly urgent. Something shifted in his posture, subtle but unmistakable. The mask of professional courtesy slipped just slightly, revealing something harder beneath. "I should go," he said, but made no move toward the door. Instead, his hand went to his phone, and I knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man watching his worst fears materialize, that he was texting her. Seconds later, Emma burst through our front door, still wearing her gym clothes, hair damp not from rain but from a shower taken God knows where. The look that passed between them lasted less than a heartbeat, but contained volumes. "Thomas." Her voice was too bright, too controlled. "I didn't expect." "James, what are you?" "The Morrison documents," he supplied smoothly, but his eyes never left her face, carrying on a silent conversation I wasn't meant to understand. I watched my wife move instinctively toward this man who wasn't her husband, watched her body align with his like a compass finding north. 15 years of marriage dissolved in that simple movement. "I can explain," Emma started, but for once, I didn't want her explanations, her carefully constructed narratives. "Can you explain why you told me you were at the client's office?" My voice sounded distant, detached. "Or why you're wearing gym clothes when your gym bag is still in our bedroom. Or maybe," I reached for her left hand, where the tan line of her wedding ring stood out starkly against her skin. "You can explain this?" The sound she made was something between a gasp and a sob. James moved slightly, positioning himself between us, protective in a way that made my vision blur with rage. "Thomas," he said, all pretense of professional distance abandoned. "You're upset." "Let's not." "Don't." The word came out like a whip crack. "Don't you dare stand in my house and try to manage me while wearing my wife's perfume." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's face had gone white, her hands trembling as she reached for stability against the wall. James remained still, but something in his eyes had changed. Resignation, perhaps, or relief that the charade was ending. "How long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Neither of them spoke, but their silence was answer enough. "Get out." The words felt like glass in my throat. "Both of you." "Thomas, please," Emma's voice cracked. "It's not what you, isn't it?" I turned to face her fully, really seeing her for the first time in months. "Then tell me, Emma. Tell me why the man you're sleeping with is standing in our foyer wearing your perfume. Tell me why your wedding ring is in your purse instead of on your finger. Tell me why every word out of your mouth lately has been a lie." She flinched as if I'd struck her, but the pain in her eyes was nothing compared to the agony in my chest. James touched her arm, a gesture so intimate, so practiced, it told its own story. "We should go," he said softly, and she nodded, broken and relieved all at once. I watched them leave together, their bodies moving in unconscious synchronization down our front walk. The rain had stopped, but water still ran down our windows, distorting the world outside into something unrecognizable, just like my life. After they left, I spent hours examining our wedding photos, trying to understand how love transforms into betrayal. The house felt like a museum of lost moments. every room holding memories that now seemed suspect. The coffee cup Emma had left that morning still sat on the counter, lipstick staining its rim, a casual remnant of domestic life about to shatter. I hadn't planned to follow her, but when her car pulled out of our driveway at 8 p.m., emergency client meeting, she texted. Something inside me finally broke. The rational voice that had been making excuses, accepting lies, fell silent. The hotel wasn't expensive or sleazy, but tasteful and discreet. The kind of place where the staff doesn't ask questions when a woman checks in wearing business attire on a weeknight. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching shadows move behind third-floor curtains, wondering if this was what madness felt like. The key card wasn't difficult to obtain. A simple story about surprising my wife for our anniversary, a flash of my driver's license showing our shared last name. The desk clerk's smile held no suspicion, just another romantic gesture in a place that had seen countless stories play out. Room 317. The number burned into my memory like a brand. I stood outside the door, listening to muffled voices, soft laughter. My hand shook as I inserted the key card, watching the light turn green with a quiet beep. The scene inside froze like a photograph. Emma perched on the edge of the bed, her blouse half unbuttoned, James emerging from the bathroom, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. The intimacy of the moment struck me more than any obvious betrayal could have. The casual comfort they shared in this stolen space. Thomas. Emma's voice cracked on my name, her face draining of color. She didn't scramble to cover herself, didn't scream or run. Instead, she just sat there, tears filling her eyes, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. James moved first, instinctively stepping between us. Let me explain. Explain? The word tasted like copper in my mouth. Explain how long you've been fucking my wife in hotel rooms? Explain how you both sat at my mother's funeral, playing the concerned friends while planning your next rendezvous. It's not like that, Emma whispered, but her hands were twisting in her lap, a gesture I now recognized as guilt rather than nervousness. Then what is it like? My voice remained eerily calm, even as I felt something fundamental breaking inside me. Help me understand, Emma. Help me understand how the woman who promised to love me forever ended up in a hotel room with another man. She stood then, and I saw the moment she decided to stop lying. It was like watching a mask dissolve, revealing the stranger beneath. I fell in love, she said simply. 3 words. Just 3 words to demolish 15 years. Love, I echoed, the word hollow in my mouth. Was that what you felt when you gaslit me? When you used my grief over Mom to make me doubt myself? Was that love? James took a step forward. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. I turned to him, really looking at this man who had dismantled my life with surgical precision. You saw what you wanted and took it. But tell me, James, does she use the same tricks with you? The careful lies, the strategic tears, the way she twists reality until you question your own sanity. Emma made a sound like breaking glass. That's not fair. Fair? I laughed, and the sound frightened even me. Fair was believing in our vows. Fair was trusting you when you said you were working late. Fair was watching you cry at my mother's funeral while texting your lover. I pulled out my phone, hand steady now. I have the hotel receipts, Emma. All of them. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 3 months. I have screenshots of your messages, the ones you thought you deleted. I have security camera footage from your gym showing you leaving with him while I was at Mom's deathbed. The color drained from her face. You've been investigating me? No, Emma. I've been proving to myself that I'm not crazy, that the woman I loved really is capable of this level of betrayal. James moved toward her, protective, possessive. The gesture made my stomach turn. You should leave, he said quietly. Leave. I gestured around the room, at the wine glasses on the nightstand, the casual intimacy they'd created in this stolen space. This is what leaving looks like, Emma. This is me walking away from every lie you've told, every moment you've twisted, every piece of myself I lost trying to believe you. I reached into my pocket and withdrew her wedding ring, the one she'd left in her jewelry box that morning, thinking I wouldn't notice. The platinum band caught the light, throwing accusatory shadows on the wall. "I found this today," I said, placing it on the dresser, "along with the birthday card from James you thought you'd hidden. To my soulmate," he wrote. "Tell me, Emma, does your soulmate know about the others?" She stiffened, and I saw James's expression shift. A small crack in their perfect facade. "What others?" His voice had lost its smooth confidence. I turned toward the door, the truth of my victory tasting like ashes. "Ask her about Richard from accounting, or Michael from HR. You're not the first, James, just the most recent." The silence that followed was absolute. In it, I heard the death of two relationships, my marriage, and whatever fantasy Emma and James had built in these stolen hours. As I closed the door behind me, I heard Emma begin to cry. Not her usual strategic tears, but genuine, broken sobs. Part of me wanted to go back, to comfort her out of 15 years of habit. Instead, I walked away, leaving behind the ruins of a life built on perfect lies. In the elevator, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirrored walls. I looked different somehow, older, harder, but also oddly peaceful. The weight of uncertainty had lifted, replaced by the clean pain of truth. Outside, the night air hit my lungs like salvation. I looked up at the third-floor window, now dark against the hotel's facade, and felt something close to pity. They would have to live with their choices, their lies, their betrayals. But I would live with the truth. And somehow, that felt like freedom. The week after the hotel confrontation passed in a blur of sleepless nights and unopened texts. I'd moved into a small rental apartment, taking only what I needed: clothes, toiletries, and my mother's old leather-bound photo album. The space felt temporary, liminal, like waiting rooms in hospitals where life-changing news hangs, suspended in fluorescent light. That's where Rachel found me, surrounded by takeout containers and silence. My mother's nurse during those final months. She'd become something of an anchor during the worst of my grief. Now she stood in my doorway, concern etching lines around her eyes. "You look terrible," she said simply, setting down a paper bag that smelled of fresh bread and soup. "When was the last time you ate something that didn't come in a plastic container?" I couldn't remember. The days had begun to blend, marked only by the steady stream of messages I refused to read. From Emma, from James, from well-meaning friends who didn't know which side to take. "Emma's gone missing," Rachel said quietly, watching my face for a reaction. "Sarah Henderson called me. No one's heard from her or James for 3 days. Something cold settled in my stomach. They probably ran away together. Seems fitting." Rachel's expression shifted, becoming careful, measured. "James was found in his apartment this morning. He'd taken an entire bottle of sleeping pills with vodka." The world tilted sideways. I grabbed the kitchen counter for support, feeling the smooth surface anchor me to reality. "He's alive," Rachel continued, moving closer. "But barely. They found a note. Well, more of a confession, really. About Emma." My laugh sounded hollow, even to my own ears. What could he possibly confess that I don't already know? Rachel's hand found mine, steady and warm. "Thomas, Emma isn't who any of us thought she was." The police found evidence in James's apartment. Documents, photographs, recordings. She's been running elaborate cons for years. Multiple identities, multiple marriages. James wasn't just her lover. He was her latest mark. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in with the weight of this new reality. "What are you saying?" Her real name is Claire Blackwood. She's wanted in 3 states for fraud and identity theft. The woman you married, she never existed. I sank into a chair, memories reshuffling like a deck of cards. Every inconsistency, every small lie, every moment that hadn't quite made sense, they aligned into a new pattern, more terrifying than mere infidelity. The Morrison account? A shell company she created. The late nights, the urgent meetings, she was setting up offshore accounts, moving money. James figured it out too late. When he confronted her, she disappeared. The words tasted like ash. Rachel nodded, pulling out her phone. On the screen was a photo I'd never seen before. Emma, or Claire, or whoever she was, at another wedding. Different name on the certificate, different man beside her, same practiced smile I'd fallen in love with. The police think there are at least 4 other husbands, Rachel said gently. All successful professionals. All left with empty bank accounts and shattered lives. I thought of the moments that had seemed most real. Her tears at our wedding, her laughter on lazy Sunday mornings, her grief at my mother's funeral. Had any of it been genuine? Or was I just another character in her elaborate performance? My mother knew. I whispered, remembering her final words. She's not who she was. A mother always sees. Rachel squeezed my hand. There's more. They found detailed notes about your family in her abandoned apartment. She'd been planning this for years before you met. Your mother's illness, your inheritance. It was all part of her calculation. The room spun. I barely made it to the bathroom before emptiness clawed its way up my throat. Rachel followed, her nurse's instincts taking over as she pressed a cool cloth to my neck. How? I managed between heaves. How did I not see? Because you loved her, Rachel said simply. Love makes us blind to the darkest truths sometimes. Later that night, alone in my sterile new apartment, I found myself looking at our wedding photos again. But this time, I wasn't searching for the moment love turned to betrayal. I was looking for the lie that had been there from the beginning. In every image, Emma, Claire, smiled that perfect smile, her eyes holding secrets I'd been too in love to read. Each frame captured not the death of love, but the careful construction of an illusion that had cost me 15 years of my life. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. A single line that made my blood freeze. I did love you in my way. That was the hardest part. I blocked the number immediately, but her words lingered like poison in my veins. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, and I wondered if they were closing in on her, this woman who had worn my wife's face while plotting my destruction. The truth, I was learning, was far more terrifying than any lie I'd imagined. Winter came early that year, frost etching delicate patterns on windows that no longer felt like mine. 6 months had passed since Emma, Claire, vanished, leaving behind a web of lies so intricate it had taken teams of investigators to unravel it. I'd spent those months learning to breathe again, each day a careful exercise in reconstruction. The trial transcript sat unopened on my coffee table. James had recovered enough to testify, his testimony revealing layers of manipulation that made my head spin. The woman we'd both loved had orchestrated everything, from our first chance meeting at a charity event to the calculated way she'd drawn him in, using our marriage as leverage to make him trust her with millions in company funds. You need to read them, Rachel said softly, her hand steady on my shoulder as she set down 2 cups of tea. She'd become a constant in my life, her presence a quiet reminder that not all connections were built on lies. I opened the folder, finding myself face to face with photographs of other lives, other marriages. Claire Blackwood's trail of destruction stretched back decades. In each image, she wore a different name, a different style, but her eyes remained the same, bottomless pools that had drowned so many men's futures. There was a life insurance policy, I said quietly, voicing the discovery that had haunted me for weeks. Taken out on my mother 3 years before her diagnosis. Claire would have collected millions if. But she didn't, Rachel interrupted firmly. Your mother's death was natural, Thomas. The investigators confirmed it. Was it? Or did she just not have time to? My voice cracked. She knew about Mom's inheritance. Had copies of the will before Mom even got sick. What if she was playing an even longer game? Rachel's fingers found mine, warm and real. Stop torturing yourself with what-ifs. Focus on what you know is true. Truth. Such a simple word for such a complex concept. I'd spent months excavating it from the ruins of my marriage, piece by jagged piece. The truth was in the safe deposit box I'd discovered, filled with USBs documenting every conversation we'd ever had. In the hidden camera she'd installed in our bedroom. In the careful notes she'd kept about my habits, my fears, my dreams. All ammunition for her perfect performance as the loving wife. I found her first husband, I said, pulling out a photograph I'd studied 100 times. David Chun, a surgeon in Boston. She took him for everything, just like the others. But he said something that keeps haunting me. Rachel waited, patient as always. He said that in all her lies, there was one truth she couldn't help but tell. That somewhere in another life, she had a daughter. A real one. And everything she did, all the cons, the stolen money, was to find her. Do you believe him? I stared at the photo of Claire's first victim, seeing my own pain reflected in his eyes. I believe she made each of us feel like we were the exception, like we were the ones who saw the real her. Maybe that's what made her so dangerous, her ability to hide truth inside lies. The winter sun cast long shadows across my apartment floor. Somewhere in the building, a child laughed, the sound carrying through walls that had never heard the patter of the children Emma and I had talked about having. The police think they've traced her to Vancouver, Rachel mentioned carefully. But the trail's already cold. I nodded, unsurprised. Claire was a ghost, slipping between identities like changing clothes. She'd probably already found her next target, crafted her next perfect lie. You know what's strange? I gathered the trial documents, finally ready to face their full truth. I'm actually grateful, in a way, not for the pain or the betrayal, but for what it taught me about myself. About survival. Rachel's eyes met mine, understanding dawning in their depths. In the months since Claire's disappearance, our friendship had deepened into something neither of us had expected. Something real, built on shared grief and genuine connection. Mom used to say that some people come into our lives to teach us who we are. I continued. Claire taught me who I'm not. I'm not a victim. I'm not broken. And I'm not afraid of truth anymore, no matter how much it hurts. Standing, I moved to the window, watching snow begin to fall. Each flake caught the light differently, unique in its crystalline truth. Behind me, Rachel gathered our teacups, her movements comfortable in this space we'd begun to share. There's one more thing, she said, hesitating. James found a letter in his things. It was written years ago, before she became Emma. Before any of this. It's addressed to someone named Lily. My heart caught. Lily. The name Emma had always said she wanted for a daughter. Do you want to read it? I turned from the window, taking in the warmth of my new life. The books Rachel had left on my coffee table, the fresh flowers she brought each week, the subtle signs of healing that had begun to fill the spaces Claire left hollow. No, I said finally. Some mysteries deserve to stay buried. Some truths are better left in the past. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blank white canvas. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new truths, new chances to trust. But for now, in this moment, I was learning to live with uncertainty, to find beauty in what remained after deception's tide receded. Claire had taught me that love could be the perfect lie. But here, in the quiet aftermath of her destruction, I was learning an even more important truth. Sometimes, in the ruins of perfect lies, we find our way to something real, something true.